This week's episode of Naked Mormonism is brought to you by $49sites.com. Visit $49sites.com and enter promo code NAKED to get a free upgrade to the Pro package.
Depending on the particular religious movement involved, after receiving a spiritual confirmation, and regardless of previous civil marital bonds, its history in Europe among various Christian primitivistic movements has been well documented. The followers of Jacob Cochrane as early as 1818 used spiritual wifery to describe their religious doctrine of free love. Often confused with polygamy, spiritual wifery among the Cochranites was the practice in which communal mates were temporarily assigned and reassigned, either by personal preference or religious authority. The term was later introduced by the Latter-day Saint movement by John C. Bennett, who openly applied it to the doctrine of plural marriage. According to Helen Mar Whitney, at the time spiritual wife was the title by which every woman who entered into this order was called, for it was taught and practiced as a spiritual order.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the Serial Mormon History Podcast. All eyes turned towards the kingdom on the Mississippi. July 8th, 1842, something which altered Mormon history forever happened. The first of Reckitt Bennett's expose letters was published in the Sangamo Journal. Bennett left the church and office of mayor in Nauvoo, and that happened in late May of 1842, and he spent most of June exchanging letters and collecting statements from people in Nauvoo. Historians forever should be thankful for the incredible wealth of data that was collected during that time. It proved invaluable in understanding aspects of Nauvoo history that were never recorded by the leaders in the church initially and would have been lost to history forever had he not collected that data. If you're a supporter of the show over on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you get the audiobook version of his massive expose, with my commentary peppered in, of course. We just finished chapter 1 this week, and next week we break into chapter 2 when Bennett finally gets into his history of Joseph Smith. It's fascinating, to say the least. For the most part, the rest of the country outside of Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri had long regarded Mormonism as a wacky and deluded religious sect, persecuted by the Missouri government, but altogether harmless. However, there were some red flags cropping up here and there, and maybe there was something more to them. The Sangamo Journal had been covering Joseph Smith and the Mormons for a couple of years by 1842. Initially, they started out largely friendly, being a Whig paper and the Mormons representing a massive unclaimed voting bloc. But as Mormonism continued to grow and flourish in Nauvoo, the Sangamo Journal started to look more like the Warsaw Signal in its antagonisms of Joseph Smith and the Mormonites. It was near the end of 1841 and beginning of 1842 where that shift really happens. So to illustrate that shift, here's a sympathetic article from June of 1841, at a time when Joe was trying to get $1.2 million from the government for the Mormons having been chased from Missouri. Here we go. Quote, "The last Register has a long article against the Mormons, not in direct terms, it is true, but still in language that cannot be misunderstood. If not, why does that paper attack Mr. Stewart for being willing to do them an act of injustice? The Mormons have been driven from Missouri and under such circumstances that they thought it their duty to make application to Congress for redress. They are constituents of Mr. Stewart, who was bound, as their representative, to prefer their claims before Congress. Yet for doing this plain act of duty, the Register reads him a lecture. That paper says, 'Let Mr. Stewart beware that he does not dig a pit for himself to fall into.' Is Mr. Stewart to dig a pit for himself by doing a simple act of justice to a portion of his constituents?" It's quite friendly, and it's defensive of the plight of the Mormon refugees. Well, here's January 1842, after Joe had done some overt political maneuvering unfavorable to the Whig politicians in the 1841 cycle. The Sangamo Journal is a little bit different in its tone and approach. Quote, "Citizens of Illinois, read and consider. The freedom of our fathers obtained for our bodies is worthless, nothing to the emancipation given them to the soul in that most sacred instrument, the Declaration of Independence. If we are justly jealous, therefore, of our rights as citizens and the freedom of our bodies as won by the blood of our fathers, how much more jealous should we be of the rights of conscience and freedom of the soul, that pearl above all price, which they have left us as a legacy. With such ideas as these, the citizens of Illinois have opened their arms to the sect called Mormons in their hour of distress. They have wept for the wrongs which they had undergone in Missouri and have shielded and guarded them until they are now numerous and fearless of danger. God grant them the sense to shun a comparison with the asp of the fables. The fable may be shortly told for their advantage. A countryman, upon a cold winter day, saw an asp, a very poisonous snake, lying torpid with cold by the roadside, and in the simple kindness of his heart, he lifted it up and took it home, where he laid it before the fire to recover, and with his wife and children kindly rejoiced in seeing life returning to the snake. After the heat had sufficiently acted upon the asp, it raised its head, and instead of thanks to its benefactor, began hissing and curling itself up, preparatory to a deadly attack upon the former, who, seeing its intent and aim, destroyed it. The moral is perceptible, and needs no words of explanation. Why have we written the above, and why do we warn our harmless brothers of Nauvoo? Simply for this. Though we have no objection that they should act individually and independently as their conscience dictates, yet when they attempt to join the civil power with the religious, they attempt to destroy our hard-earned birthright of liberty and conscience, and compel us to retaliate for the injury done." End quote. The Sangamo Journal's perspective of the Mormons was a perfect outlet for Bennett's expose to be published. It was out of Springfield, Illinois, the capital, and roughly the size of Chicago in mid-1842, with nationwide readership. They had a platform big enough and a sympathetic audience whose opinions of the Mormons had largely been shaped by articles printed throughout early 1842 about the Mormons, which grew more scathing as the year progressed in a crucial governor election year, and Joe's political power waxed critical. They landed the contract with Bennett to begin publishing his letters exposing the Mormons. Bennett quickly rose to social prominence and began writing the public lecture circuit to packed churches, public meeting houses, and Masonic halls all over Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, and, of course, Missouri. Anywhere that would organize a gathering to hear a lecture on the deluded religious fanatics known as the Mormons, Bennett would travel hundreds of miles to present his information. The first article that published his expose came out on July 8, 1842, printed alongside a number of other articles, sharply critical of Joe and the Mormons. So let's dive in. Let's get into this entire issue of the Sangamo Journal. But before we do, we need to set the stage of the political and cultural climate that brought this article to fruition. The soon-to-be elected governor of Illinois, Thomas Ford, wrote his History of Illinois beginning in 1847. He was one of the most active lawyers and politicians in the state, boasting that he attended every state legislature session from 1825 to 1847 when he left politics and then died 3 years later. His History of Illinois, published posthumously, provides important political and social commentary as a contemporary source of Nauvoo Mormonism from an authoritative source who saw what happened from the inside and outside of Nauvoo politics. Thomas Ford wasn't yet on Joe and the Mormons' radar until mid-1842, but he won the November election that year, largely due to the Mormons, and became the new governor representing Nauvoo and the Mormons. Ford truly illustrates just how much power Joe wielded in Nauvoo and the entire state of Illinois. Here are just a few select passages from his book, History of Illinois. You'll find a link to the archive.org version of it in the show notes if you choose to chase it. Quote, "In this state of the case, Dr. John C. Bennett presented himself at the seat of the government as the agent of the Mormons. This Bennett was probably the greatest scamp in the Western country. I have made particular inquiries concerning him and have traced him in several places in which he had lived before he had joined the Mormons in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and he was everywhere accounted the same debauched, unprincipled, and profligate character. He was a man of some little talent, and then had the confidence of the Mormons, and particularly that of their leaders. He came as the agent of the people to solicit a city charter, a charter for a military legion, and for various other purposes. This person addressed himself to Mr. Little, the Whig senator from Hancock, and to Mr. Douglas, the Democratic Secretary of State, who both entered heartily into his views and projects. Bennett managed matters well for his constituents. He flattered both sides with the hope of Mormon favor, and both sides expected to receive their votes." End quote. Now, the next passage we're going to read, I think, is quite interesting, because history can be a great way of understanding what the future can possibly hold. That's why I'm so fascinated by history. Ford goes on to illustrate the folly and unintended consequences of pushing through government bills and charters without everybody reading and comprehending the matters and ramifications contained in said bills and charters. The Nauvoo Charter was passed through without a single person reading it top to bottom, and Ford remarks, quote, "The same universal zeal in its favor was manifested here, which had been so conspicuously displayed in the Senate," end quote, speaking, of course, of the legislature. And for the unintended consequences of the Nauvoo Charter being passed so hastily through the Illinois government at the behest of Reckitt Bennett, Ford goes on to say, quote, "This seemed to give them power to pass ordinances in violation of the laws of the state, and to erect a system of government for themselves. This charter also established a mayor's court with exclusive jurisdiction in all cases arising under city ordinances, subject to an appeal to the municipal court. Thus it was proposed to reestablish for the Mormon government within a government, a legislature with power to pass ordinances at war with laws of the state, courts to execute them with but little dependence upon the constitutional judiciary, and a military force at their own command, to be governed by its own bylaws and ordinances, and subject to no state authority but that of the governor. It must be acknowledged that these charters were unheard of and anti-republican in many particulars, and capable of infinite abuse by a people disposed to abuse them. The powers conferred were expressed in language at once ambiguous and undefined, as if on purpose to allow of misconstruction. The great law of separation of the powers of government was wholly disregarded." End quote. So why is this relevant, right? Why am I reading all of this? The Mormons had total and complete theocratic power in Nauvoo, and Joe stood atop that empire. This is simply terrifying for so many reasons. He wasn't beholden to any civil authorities. He had his own army and was truly bulletproof, legally speaking. As long as he was in Nauvoo, however. I mean, his power didn't extend beyond the city limits, and it wasn't actually bulletproof so much as just slightly bullet resistant. But from the Mormon side of the equation, Joe was still leveraging the trauma the Mormons had experienced in Missouri in order to build up the persecution narrative and extend his political power. The Missourians were the common enemy, and they were just trying to kill the prophet at all times, of course. Every time he was arrested, it wasn't a legal posse of constables executing a warrant under authority from the government. It was the Missourians kidnapping the prophet to kill him under the guise of lawful proceedings. Ford captures the collective mind of the Mormons in talking about Joe's 1841 arrest, where Bennett, as master in chancery, along with Justice Stephen A. Douglas, granted the writ of habeas corpus and released him. After that, he says this, quote, "The Mormons anticipated a further demand from Missouri and a further writ from the governor of the state for the arrest of their prophet and leaders. They professed to believe that the public mind in Missouri was so prejudiced against them that a fair trial there was out of the question, and that if their leaders were taken to Missouri for trial and not convicted upon evidence, they would be murdered by a mob before they could get out of the state. Some mode of permanent protection, therefore, against the demands of Missouri became a matter of vital importance, and they set their ingenuity to work to devise a scheme of protection by means of their own city ordinances, to be executed by their own municipal court." End quote. So the persecution narrative that Joseph was creating was very successful in banding the Mormons together. Eventually, it wasn't just Missourians, but all mobocrats that were the Mormons' collective enemy. That became the buzzword that Joe used to instill fear in the minds of thousands of people, re-traumatizing them by recounting the persecution that they'd suffered in Missouri at the hands of the mobocrats, and successfully created the idea of a cohesive, balkanized group against this common enemy of the mobocrats. But from the state's perspective, Joseph Smith was still a fugitive. He'd been imprisoned awaiting a jury trial on charges of arson, robbery, and treason against the United States. His conduct in Missouri rightfully earned him a one-way ticket to the gallows, should he be captured by the Missouri State Militia and taken to Missouri to face the law. That's just facts. You can't get out from under those. Joe broke the law by committing offenses deserving of the death penalty, and he escaped the custody of the state. All of that transpired before the collective opinion of the rest of the country understood that Joe had commanded his destroying angel to assassinate an ex-governor who was running for Missouri State Senate at the time. Now, this clever little plan they devised that Ford alluded to earlier was to expand the power of the issuance of writs of habeas corpus. They made it so any person arrested in Nauvoo under authority from any government body of any state, and even the largely impotent federal government, that needed to be approved by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. Here's the charter, quote, "The charter intended to give the jurisdiction only in cases where imprisonment was a consequence of a breach of some ordinance, but it was interpreted by the Mormons to authorize the enlargement and extension of the jurisdiction of the court by ordinance. This ordinance will figure very largely in the proceedings of the Mormons hereafter," end quote. And it did. This expansion of the ordinance allowing for writs of habeas corpus to be issued against any government authority, well, let's just say it carved out a nice little loophole for Joe. He was a big player in the field of national politics. Now, his letter book on the Joseph Smith papers throughout 1839 to 1844 almost includes more letters to politicians and dignitaries than it does fellow leaders of the church. Joe had curried favor with many politicians who were salivating to get thousands of votes from the Mormon bloc. Mormonism and opposition to it truly was one of the few driving political forces in Illinois in the early 1840s. And that sets the political landscape for the rest of what we're reading today. And that sets the stage for the Bennett expose meltdown and the cultural impacts that it created. Joe tried to get ahead of this coming firestorm and did so by smearing John C. Bennett's name. He did that by leveraging his political connections with a few letters to and from Governor Carlin of Illinois. Nothing could stop what was about to happen. Nothing could stop the resultant political and social backlash in response to John C. Bennett's exposés. But Joe could brace for impact, and that's what he did. So the very first relevant letter that he sent was on June 24th, 1842. This was sent to Governor Carlin. Quote, "Dear Sir, it becomes my duty to lay before you some facts relative to the conduct of our Major General John C. Bennett, which have been proven beyond the possibility of dispute and which he himself has admitted to be true in my presence." And no other corroborating evidence for them, of course. Joe just said that Bennett said these things. "It is evident that his general character is that of an adulterer of the worst kind. And although he has a wife and children living, circumstances which have transpired in Nauvoo have proven to a demonstration that he cares not whose character is disgraced, whose honor is destroyed, nor who suffers, so that his lustful appetite may be gratified. And further, he cares not how many nor how abominable the falsehood he has to make use of to accomplish his wicked purposes, even should it be that he brings disgrace upon a whole community. Some time ago, it having been reported to me that some of the most aggravating cases of adultery had been committed upon some previously respectable females in our city, I took proper measures to ascertain the truth of the report, and was soon enabled to bring sufficient witnesses before proper authority to establish the following facts. More than 12 months ago, Bennett went to a lady in the city and began to teach her that promiscuous intercourse between the sexes was lawful and no harm in it, and requested the privilege of gratifying his passions, but she refused in the strongest terms, saying that it was very wrong to do so, and it would bring a disgrace on the church. Finding this argument ineffectual, he told her that men in higher standing in the church than himself not only sanctioned but practiced the same deeds, and in order to finish the controversy said and affirmed that I both taught and acted in the same manner, but publicly proclaimed against it in consequence of the prejudice of the people and fear of trouble in my own house. By this means he accomplished his designs. He seduced a respectable female with lying and subjected her to public infamy and disgrace. Not contented with what he had already done, he made the attempt on others, and by using the same language, seduced them also. About the early part of July 1841, I received a letter from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In it was contained information setting forth that Bennett had a wife and 2 or 3 children then living. This I read to him, and he acknowledged it was true. A very short time after this, he attempted to destroy himself by taking poison, but being discovered before it had taken sufficient effect and proper antidotes administered, he again recovered." End quote. Now, the language that Joe used here is quite misleading. Primarily, it's absolutely insane to claim that Bennett tried to kill himself. Now, his expose reveals some disturbing details of what happened 3 days after Joe sent this letter, stating that Bennett had tried to kill himself. Namely, Nauvoo was a dangerous place for any apostates, but an apostate of such a high caliber as Reckitt Bennett, his time was limited in Nauvoo. The Danites took to a new pastime of following Bennett around ominously. This is from John C. Bennett's History of the Saints. Quote, "In my communication to the Sangamo Journal of the 27th June, 1842, I stated that I had been threatened with death by the Holy Joe and his Danite band of murderers, in case I dare make any disclosures prejudicial to that polluted mass of corruption, iniquity, and fraud, that king of impostors, the holy and immaculate Joe Smith. And in my communication of July 2nd, I stated that, when on my journey to Springfield, on my arrival in Carthage, I found, as all citizens well know, that I was followed by Mr. Orrin Porter Rockwell, a Danite, who, on his arrival late in the night, made strict inquiries as to where I was. His ostensible business was to put a letter in the post office. Bah! I was prepared for the gentleman, and he approached me not, but another swift rider, Captain John D. Parker, another Danite, followed me to Springfield to carry a letter to Dr. Helm. Ah! Ha! Bah! Yeah, those are actually in there. I told Captain Parker that I was aware of his object, but I feared him not. At Virginia, in Cass County, on my return, Parker met me again, and I called the attention of the stage driver to him, who, thereupon, put 2 additional balls into his pistol and observed to me that he was then ready for him or any other person having the same object in view. On the 23rd of June, 1842, the Holy Prophet, in an article over his own name, published in the Nauvoo Wasp of June 25th, threatened me with vengeance of the Lord, in the following language. Now quoting the Wasp, "Unless he," Bennett, "is determined to bring sudden destruction upon himself from the hand of the Almighty, the destroying angel, he will be silent." End quote. Back to Bennett. In order to fulfill this prediction, on the evening of 29th of June, the destroying angel approached my boarding house, General Robinson's, in Nauvoo, with their carriage wheels wrapped with blankets and their horses' feet muffled with cloths to prevent noise, about 10 o'clock for the purpose of conveying me off for sudden destruction or assassination, so as to make me silent and thus prevent disclosures. Dead men tell no tales. But, as I had an intimation of the matter in the afternoon, I borrowed 2 pistols of General Robinson and one of Mr. Hunter, a merchant, and loaded them with slugs. Besides these, I had 2 bowie knives, and some of my friends were likewise well armed, well prepared to give the angel a warm reception. So, after prowling around the house, the lights which were extinguished, for some time the hand of the Almighty withdrew. On the 6th of July, Mr. Jotham Clark told me in Carthage, in the presence of Dr. Thomas L. Barnes and Mr. Jonas Hobart, that he, having business near there, came into town to tell me that the Mormons had threatened my life, and warned me to be on my guard. This is the treatment dissenters receive when they come out of the modern Babylon, that mother of harlots, by the saints of the last days. End quote. Sure, did he try to kill himself, as Joe stated? Did Bennett try and poison himself when Joe confronted him? I mean, come on. The Danites did continue to follow Bennett around. George Miller, on behalf of Joe, sent a letter to Governor Reynolds of Missouri, who'd replaced Lilburn Boggs in 1840. Missourians hated the Mormons. Bennett would find an audience ready to hear of the depraved character of Joe Smith in that state. The letter takes on a tone of friendship with the citizens of Missouri because, of course, the Mormons only wanted friendship with Missouri since they were driven from the state 3 years prior. This letter documents a remarkable shift in tone from how the Mormons had previously been dealing with Missourians. The content of this letter is only accurate if you don't take into consideration all of the sermons against the Missouri mobocrats and the violent rhetoric that had been preached against the Missourians since the Mormon settlement in Nauvoo. Here's the letter written by George Miller to Governor Reynolds of Missouri on behalf of Joseph Smith. Quote, "The object of this communication is therefore to inform you of the true character of said John C. Bennett, that he may not injure the innocent by gaining credence with you or those over whom your excellency is placed to govern. We have learned from respectable sources that said John Cook Bennett has entered into a conspiracy with some of the citizens of your state to bring a mob upon us and thereby disturb our peaceful vocations of life and destroy and drive us from our homes and firesides. Believing that your excellency cannot be influenced by the popular prejudice almost everywhere entertained against us on account of our peculiar religious tenets," that's the only reason, because it's a weird religion, right? "I am the more free to write to you without reserve, knowing that the high-toned and honorable men of the earth will not be easily carried away by popular opinion or vulgar prejudice, but will always be found on the side of law, abiding portion of community, and will suppress, so far as in them lies, every movement that tends to abridge the rights or mar the peace and happiness of any portion of the citizens of our common country." Taking on quite a friendly tone. Hey, just, you're responsible for the people. Don't let them be mean to us, please. "I have resided in this city near 3 years and attached myself to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints soon after their location here, and I've had a good opportunity of learning the feelings of the leading members of said church in regard to the citizens of Missouri, which are of the most friendly nature." Oh, of course they are. "Ever desiring to live in peace and cultivate friendship with all the citizens of your state, as also all the states and all mankind generally, it being a principle of our faith to cultivate friendship and live in peace with all mankind. And if Dr. John Cook Bennett or any other person may conspire with your citizens of your state to bring upon us mob violence, we confide in you as one who will, under all circumstances, interpose the strong arm of the law in the suppression of conspiracies or mobs or any other violation of law. As citizens of the United States, we claim the protection of the several states and the United States in all our constitutional rights, and having learned something of your character, we the more confidently expect your protection against all lawless aggressions by any of the citizens of your state." End quote. Look, we've had our differences. A lot of people are saying that a Danite was sent to shoot your predecessor, Boggs, but that Bennett guy, he's working to conspire against us with the citizens of your state. So could you just just help us out by prosecuting anybody who tries to conspire with him? They're your constituents. You should be responsible for all of the actions of every Missourian. We just want your protection, and we also want you to forget everything that happened between us for the past 5 years. And, the whole evaded arrests and the violent rhetoric and all that stuff, the Missouri Mormon War. Just don't worry about that. Are we cool? We cool, bro? Yeah, we're totally cool. It's incredible to see that article just stand alone. However, given the context of that letter and the communications with other elected officials, some confusion must have existed in the mind of Governor Carlin of Illinois, because Joe sent his first communication and then required after that was a personal meeting. Joe was trying to stay as concealed as possible for fear of his life at the beginning of July 1842, but he didn't mind sending his best emissary. And I'm going to read a little bit before the actual meeting in order to put some of the information into context. This is from Mormon Enigma, page 121. Quote, "Joseph announced that ex-Governor Lilburn Boggs of Missouri had been shot and seriously wounded. Boggs had made a number of enemies, but none were stronger or more bitter than the Mormons. Thus, the Missourians, who suspected the Mormons, and Joseph Smith in particular, of being responsible for the attack, renewed their efforts to arrest Joseph. Talk of extradition was everywhere in Nauvoo. The week after Frederick Smith's 6th birthday, the child announced to all the house at breakfast that he had a dream and, quote, the Missourians had got their heads knocked off." Back to Enigma. In addition, John C. Bennett's exposés and emotional rhetoric fueled anti-Mormon feelings in Illinois. Joseph wrote Illinois Governor Thomas Carlin a letter responding to Bennett's accusations and alerting the governor to the Missouri threats. Determined to help Joseph, Emma took Eliza R. Snow and Amanda Barnes Smith with her to Quincy to see Carlin in July. Amanda Smith had lost her first husband and a son at the Hans Mill massacre, while another son had had his hip shot away. Emma probably invited her to describe the Missouri mobs. Thomas Carlin greeted the women cordially and listened to Emma plead Joseph's case. With assurance and self-confidence, she explained that she did not ask for Joseph's safety alone, but observed that if Joseph's freedom was endangered by unlawful arrests and attempts were made on his life while incarcerated in Missouri, then hundreds of Mormons' lives were equally threatened. Emma assured him that Joseph had not participated in the attempted assassination of Governor Boggs. When Carlin said he would not advise Joseph to trust himself in Missouri, Emma challenged him to protect Joseph by invoking the laws of Illinois and secured his statement that he would use full legal means to protect the Mormons. Of the meeting, Eliza commented in her journal, quote, "It remains for the time and circumstance to prove the sincerity of his professions," end quote. So after these three women met with Governor Carlin, Joe and Governor Carlin exchanged letters again. Carlin decided to side with Joe and believed that Bennett was the depraved scoundrel that Joe claimed him to be in the previous letter. The meeting taken with Emma must have had an influence on Carlin as well. But as Eliza said, it remains for time and circumstance to prove the sincerity of his profession. So this letter was written by Governor Carlin, and it was sent to Joseph Smith, dated June 30th, 1842. Quote, "Dear Sir, I received by the last mail your letter of the 24th instant, in which you have thought proper to give me a statement of charges against the conduct and character of General John C. Bennett. I can say that I regret that any individual should so far disregard his obligations to his God and to his fellow man as to condescend to the commission of crimes alleged in your letter to have been perpetrated by General Bennett. It is, however, in accordance with representations of his character made to me more than 2 years since, and which I then felt constrained to believe were true, since which time I have desired to have as little intercourse with him as possible." So he's, just saying that Bennett was a horrible person, and he had heard, rumors that he was a horrible person 2 years before the Mormons ever hooked up with him. So that is an interesting little side note. "No resignation of his commission as Major General of the Nauvoo Legion has reached me. Some weeks since I read a short notice from him stating that you had reason to believe that a conspiracy was getting up in the state of Missouri for the purpose of mobbing the Mormons at Nauvoo and kidnapping you and taking you to that state, and requested to be informed in case of such mob, whether you would be protected by the authorities of this state, etc. To which I replied that all men were held amenable to the laws, so in like manner the rights of all would be protected, and the dignity of the state maintained, to the letter of the Constitution and laws. The above is, in substance, the contents of his note to me and my reply to him, having destroyed his letter as I considered it of no use should it be retained." End quote. But Carlin wasn't done. So Bennett may have been a terrible person, and he may have heard of Bennett's reputation, a few months before he joined the Mormons in Nauvoo in late 1840, but the language that Carlin used in the letter was very calculated. He said all men were held amenable to the laws. What does that mean? Was he saying that Bennett conspiring against the Mormons was something that he'd be held legally accountable for? Or was he saying to Joe that all men, including Joseph Smith, are held accountable to the law for any misconduct? That's a typical politician answer, right? The rest of the letter makes his position clear as mud, just like the previous passage. However, it becomes very clear that Carlin was aware of the rhetoric that Joe was spewing, that it was no longer idle rhetoric because Boggs had just suffered the wrath of some unknown assassin. All of the rhetoric the Mormons had been using against mobocrats and Governor Lilburn Boggs for his extermination order, somehow that resulted in Boggs getting shot. If you're Governor Carlin in this situation, that seems to become a very real threat to you. He goes on to say, quote, "You state that you have heard that I have of late entertained unfavorable feelings towards you, the Mormons, as a people, and especially so with regard to yourself, etc., etc. If this should be true, you would be pleased to know from me the reasons of such hostile feelings." Now he goes on to articulate why he may have some hostile feelings towards the Mormons. In reply, I can in truth say that I do not entertain nor cherish hostile or revengeful feelings towards any man or set of men on earth, but that I may have used strong expressions in reference to yourself at times, when my indignation has been somewhat aroused by repeated admonitions of my friends, both before and since the attempt to assassinate Governor Lilburn Boggs, to be upon my guard, that you had prophesied that Boggs should die a violent death, and that I should die in a ditch. All this, however, if true, I looked upon it as idle boasting until since the assassination of Boggs. Now that's an important point. We have Governor Boggs. Joseph prophesied that he would die a violent death, and he just got shot. Then we have Joseph claiming that Governor Carlin would die in a ditch. Governor Carlin regarded all as just idle rhetoric, idle boasting, as he said, until Boggs was almost assassinated. Yeah, it brought everything to reality. I cannot view it in any other light, because whatever your feelings may have been towards Boggs, the mere discharge of an official duty on my part enjoined upon me by the Constitution of the laws and of this state and of the United States could not possibly engender feelings of such deep malignity. Be assured that this matter gives me no uneasiness, nor would the subject now have been mentioned. Had you requested a reply to your inquiries, I have seen your denial published in the Wasp of the prediction attributed to you, of the death or assassination of Governor Boggs. Be that true or false, nothing has contributed more towards fixing the belief upon the public mind that you had made such prediction, than the repeated statements of a portion of your followers that the manner of his death had been revealed to you, and their exultation that it must needs be fulfilled. Now, that is an important point, that regardless of whether or not you're responsible for the death or almost death of Governor Boggs, the fact that you quote-unquote predicted it and then he suffered an assassin's bullets, that has been bandied around, that was prophecy and prophecy had been fulfilled. And the Mormons' sentiments and collective mind said their exultation that it must needs be fulfilled, that prophecy. That's terrifying. Let's finish up his letter here. In reference to your request to be advised how you should act in case a mob should come upon you, I should feel very much at a loss to recommend any course for you to adopt other than to resort to the first law of nature, to defend your own rights, because were I to advise a quiet submission on your part, I could not expect that you would fold your arms and silently look on whilst those rights were violated and outraged as long as you have the power to protect them. I, however, have not the most distant thought that there exists at present any real cause for the apprehension of a mob coming upon you. Otherwise, I should feel it in my duty to endeavor to arrest it." End quote. So, everything that came out of that, Carlin made it clear enough that if a mob came to arrest or quote-unquote kidnap Joe, it would be too late for the governor to react. So, act upon the first law of nature. Get the hell out of there. Those fears were justified in Joseph and the Mormons' minds. Unrest existed all around, and to complicate matters further, a zombie arose from the grave, which only blew more fuel into the fire for the Mormon leadership while they were trying to deal with the Bennett scandal that was currently, raging in the community. Quote, "Lilburn W. Boggs, who being duly sworn doth depose and say that on the night of the 6th day of May, 1842, while sitting in his dwelling, he was shot with intent to kill, and that his life was despaired of for several days, and that he believes, and has good reason to believe from evidence and information now in his possession, that O.P. Rockwell is the person who shot him, and the said deponent hereby applies to the governor of the state of Illinois, Governor Carlin, to deliver the said O.P. Rockwell to some person authorized to receive him and convey him to the county aforesaid, there to be dealt with according to law." End quote. That was a real problem, because now the collective mind knew for a fact, at least in Nauvoo, that Joseph had given this prophecy that Boggs would die a violent death. He had been shot. Now, Lilburn Boggs wasn't dead, and he swore out an affidavit against Orrin Porter Rockwell, pistol back in port, and explicitly called on Governor Carlin to arrest Rockwell and send him to Missouri. Now, I'm of the opinion that Port shot Boggs. It's a matter of conjecture and that will never be resolved, but there's location, circumstance, opportunity, and plenty of motive which allow Port to be the assailant here. Whether or not Port actually pulled the trigger, that doesn't matter, because everybody believed that he did. That's what really matters. Governor Carlin of Illinois couldn't simply stand idly by with somebody living in his state who had tried to assassinate a high-profile politician during his senatorial election campaign. How does that look on Governor Carlin's character? So, Carlin drafted the writ of arrest for Porter, likely without Joe knowing at this time. So, Illinois constables could bring Porter Rockwell into the custody and extradite him to the Missouri government. And unfortunately, we'll have to pick up on that next episode. But to walk it back a little bit here, Joe took the language in Carlin's letter to mean that he'd be kept safe from the Missouri constables, who'd inevitably come into Nauvoo to arrest him, both for the previous charges and for conspiracy to assassinate an elected official. Joe's rap sheet was getting longer every year, and with Boggs's attempted murder added to the list, it was reaching critical mass. But no interstate police force existed in the United States at this time. That would take Prohibition, the Great Depression, and career criminal bank robbers and bootleggers in order to create that interstate police force. So the Missouri government officials only had jurisdiction in Illinois on limited explicit orders from Governor Carlin. But that new ordinance described by the soon-to-be Governor Ford that I read earlier made it so any arrest made in Nauvoo would need to pass through the Nauvoo court system first. And we'll get to that, like I said, next episode. So in response to Carlin's letter and the protectionism that Joe read into the language there, Joe quickly penned a letter to Governor Carlin, thanking him for his hospitality in receiving Emma and the other two women to that previous meeting. The protection that Joe was evidently assuming was never explicitly stated by Carlin. He was a politician. He said that all men are held to the standards and laws, and his language can be interpreted in multiple ways. But Joe chose to interpret it in a way that was favorable to him. Quote, "Esteemed Sir, your favor of the 27th instant for Major General Wilson Law is before me. I cannot let this opportunity pass without tendering you my warmest thanks for the friendly treatment my lady as well as those with her received at your hands during the late visit, and also for the friendly feelings breathed forth in your letter. Your Excellency may be assured that they are duly appreciated by me and shall ever be reciprocated." You scratch my back. Come over here, I'll scratch yours. "I am perfectly satisfied with regard to the subject under consideration and with your remarks. I shall consider myself and our citizens secure from harm under the broad canopy of law under your administration. We look to you for protection in the event of any violence being used towards us, knowing that our innocence with regard to all accusations in circulation will be duly evidenced before an enlightened public. Any service we can do the state at any time will be cheerfully done." I'll scratch your back. "For our ambition is to be serviceable to our country. With sentiments of respect and esteem, I remain your humble servant. Signed, Joseph Smith." End quote. Chaos continued to build. We'll get into that in a minute, but first, a word from our sponsor this week, $49sites.com. Hey everybody, have you been to the revamped nakedmormonismpodcast.com website yet? It's really cool. So let me tell you about something that happened last week. I had a listener send in a message asking if I've done anything with the Lucy Mack Smith biographical sketches book. Now, I've used it a few times here and there, but when I read the most from it was during our Mother's Day special episode a few months ago. Now, I didn't remember what episode that was, just that it was an episode. So I went to the website built by $49sites.com and used the handy-dandy search bar to crawl the backlog and show notes, and boom, there it was. I found the episode and other episodes where Lucy Mack's biography was included in the show notes, and it was all just on one page. $49 Sites built a robust and functional site with search engine optimization. So not only could I have used that search bar on the website, but I could have just Googled it and the exact episode would have come up. The algorithms they use to optimize search engine data are exactly what I need to increase Google search results and increase visibility and therefore traffic. And the traffic on the site since the site was overhauled by $49 Sites, it has increased so much. It's a super professional site and it's built for usability. Even more important than all of that, it works on mobile just as well as desktops, which is more and more important the way that people use the internet today. So if you need a website for yourself, a small business, or to make a blog that doesn't look like everybody else's blog out there, $49sites.com is the way to get it. If you use promo code NAKED, you get a free upgrade to the Pro plan. Now, a standard plan gets you daily backups, it gets you hosting, professional copywriting, access to stock images, unlimited updates, and they do all of that with no startup costs. You just sign up and you're immediately in touch with a directing team. $49 Sites puts you in contact with their expert web building group, and they know what they're doing. I know from firsthand experience that they are extremely professional and adept at building websites. My project manager is super attentive, and she takes all of the headache out of running a website off of my shoulders. It's so nice. And if you use that promo code NAKED at checkout, you get everything I said earlier, plus Google Analytics, a photo gallery with sliders to view the photos, Google Map integration, text animation, and a whole suite of other features, and you get that all at the regular price. So go to $49sites.com and enter promo code NAKED at checkout to get a full professional website that will earn the respect you or your company needs to compete. Once again, that's $49sites.com. Enter promo code NAKED. $49sites.com. Why have you waited this long? Bennett's first expose letters were published in the Sangamo Journal, July 8, 1842. His first letter was published among a number of other salacious and inflammatory articles against the Mormon Church, which didn't come from Bennett explicitly. We're going to read through a bunch of those articles today. Why? Because this issue of the Sangamo Journal changed Mormonism forever. Not only that, it changed Joe in ways that we can't imagine for the remaining 2 years of his life. This is an important issue of the newspaper, not only for the content, but for the impact it had on society and the collective psyche of the Mormons. The Sangamo Journal was a Whig paper, whereas Thomas Ford was running as the Democrat candidate for the office of governor. The issue on July 8th, 1842 takes plenty of opportunity to torpedo Ford and any other Democrat currying favor with the Mormons. The Sangamo Journal was trying to make the Mormons a liability, but in 1842, they were a large enough voting bloc and population to be counted as an asset instead. Let's read through it. From page 2 of the Sangamo Journal, just a whole bunch of extracts with a little bit of commentary peppered in. Quote, "The Mormon plot and league by which Thomas Ford and John Moore hope to be elected governor and lieutenant governor of Illinois. Such has been the demand for that number of our paper containing the evidence upon which we found the charge that the leaders of the Van Buren party of this state have entered into a plot and league to obtain the votes of Joe Smith's subjects for their candidates of governor and lieutenant governor. That we feel it our duty to republish the documentary evidence in the case and other facts showing the dangerous nature of this corrupt and scandalous coalition, and the first acts of incorporation for the benefit of the Mormons smuggled through the legislature without reading by the leaders of the party." End quote. After that, it goes on to detail a few points of the Nauvoo Charter seen as particularly egregious violations of the Free Republic of America. And it makes really solid points all along their, deconstruction of the Charter. And we're not going to read through that because long time ago, we read through the Nauvoo Charter in the podcast, from top to bottom. We're not going to read that because it makes similar points that I made when I was reading through it here. But after that, it goes on to print the growing political sway of Joe and the Nauvoo Legion. It details how Stephen A. Douglas had visited Nauvoo, reprinting a Times and Seasons article from May of 1841, written presumably by Joseph Smith. Quote, "I had the honor of receiving a visit from the Honorable Stephen A. Douglas, Justice of the Supreme Court and Judge of the 5th Judicial Circuit of the State of Illinois, who addressed the Assembly and expressed his satisfaction at what he had seen and heard respecting our people, and took that opportunity of returning thanks to the citizens of Nauvoo for conferring upon him the freedom of the city, stating that he was not aware of rendering us any service of sufficient importance to deserve such marked honor." End quote. Oh, the Mormons were just so nice to Stephen A. Douglas. He hadn't done anything to deserve such nice treatment. How could he possibly repay them? Now, when you take all of these articles and to the context of the entire paper, and especially knowing that they're publishing Bennett's first expose letter after all of these articles, which we'll get into next episode. It all weaves together a cohesive argument that the Mormons are too powerful. They wield far too much political sway. That is the argument and the problem that it's making here. So after that, pleasant little article that was reprinted out of the Times of Seasons, it details Joe's arrest the following month in 1841, and that his writ of habeas corpus was heard by Stephen A. Douglas, who immediately granted that writ and let Joe go free. Had Douglas not granted the writ, Joe would have remained in the custody of the Missouri constables and had been shipped off to the Missouri to answer for his crimes. So Douglas, in that June of 1841 hearing, quite literally saved Joe's life by granting the writ. It continues to assail Douglas's political flaccidness in opposing the growing power of Joe and the Mormons when it came to appointing Bennett as master in chancery, and an issue between state funds going to the Nauvoo Legion and fines being assessed against them. So thanks to Douglas bending over backwards for the Mormons and Joseph Smith repeatedly, any orders assessed against the Nauvoo Legion for any matter needed to go through the master in chancery, which was John Circa Bennett, appointed to that position by Stephen A. Douglas. In commenting on Douglas's overt friendliness to the Mormons and enshrining their will above the laws of the state and the country's constitution, the Sangamo Journal reprints another Times of Seasons article which was published in a response to the Warsaw Signal article, and this is from June of 1841. Quote, "We can hardly find language to express our surprise and disapprobation at the conduct of the editor of the Signal as manifested in that paper. We had fondly hoped that the sentiments therein expressed would never have dared to be uttered by any individual in this community in which we reside, and we would ask the editor of the Signal what is the cause of his hostility, of this sudden and unexpected ebullition of feeling, this spirit of opposition and animosity. Whose rights have been disturbed? General Bennett has been appointed master in chancery by Judge Douglas, and General Bennett is a Mormon." End quote. Warsaw Signal, Thomas Sharp, what are you getting so bent out of shape about? Stephen A. Douglas is just a friend, and he appointed General Bennett, who's a friend as well. It doesn't matter if they're Mormon. Well, the Sangamo Journal, in response to that, comments on the implications and results of this article when they say, quote, "The Times of Seasons is astonished that an editor dare comment on this transaction. We fear that it is dangerous for a man to speak or act his sentiments in relation to Joe Smith. If he does it, it is with the mangled and bloody body of Governor Boggs before his mind's eye, shot by an assassin in his own house in the bosom of his family, while unconscious that he had an enemy in the world, which act has been pronounced by high Mormon authority a noble deed." End quote. Yeah. Yeah. Douglas, Bennett, they're friends of the Mormons. Just don't be an enemy to the Mormons. Don't you dare speak out against the Mormons, because if you do, all you'll see in your mind's eye is the mangled and bloody body of Governor Boggs, shot and nearly dead. See, all of these issues are culminating together, weaving a massive public backlash against the Mormons that's just coming to fruition here in July of 1842. This issue of the Sangamo Journal continues to get even more fascinating after these articles. Never in any single place have I seen such a masterful articulation of Joe's political motives and endgames cobbled together on a single piece of paper. After commenting on that exchange between Thomas Sharp and the Warsaw Signal at the Times of Seasons, it continues to puzzle together the real intent of the Mormons by reprinting a small extract from Rignon's July 4th oration in 1838. We called it the Red Sermon on this show, which was the oration that lit the powder keg that kicked off the Mormons' war in Missouri. Then the Sangamo Journal prints an extract from the Book of Commandments, page 191, as follows, quote, "Wherefore I say unto you that I have sent unto you my everlasting covenant, namely the Book of Mormon, even that which was from the beginning, and that which I have promised I have so fulfilled, and that the nations of the earth shall bow to it. And if not of themselves, they shall come down, for that which is now exalted of itself shall be laid low by power." End quote. Make no mistake, the sentiment captured in that scripture passage has never left the collective consciousness of the Mormon mindset. The nations of the earth shall bow to the Book of Mormon. Plenty of Mormons today sincerely believe the church will somehow rule the world when Jesus comes back to reign. Now, it had a slightly different connotation in Joe's day than it had today because, well, what is it? History is a foreign land. But the central idea that the church will be the sole governing authority post-apocalypse is still very much alive to this day. To make the point of how such a revolution would take place, the Sangamo Journal prints a few extracts from The Voice of Warning by P. Parley Parker Pratt. This was the first Mormon missionary tract published in 1838, I believe. They print the following, quote, "Wherefore the voice of the Lord is unto the ends of the earth, that all that will hear may. Prepare ye for that which is to come, for the Lord is nigh, and the anger of the Lord is kindled, and his sword is sheathed in heaven, and it shall fall upon the inhabitants of the earth. And they that will not hear the voice of his servants, neither give heed to the words of the prophets and apostles, shall be cut off from among the people. Wherefore I have called upon the weak things of the world, those who are unlearned and despised, to thrash the nations by the power of my spirit. And their arm shall be my arm, and I will be their shield and their buckler. I will gird up their loins, and they shall fight manfully for me, and their enemies shall be under their feet. And I will let fall the sword in their behalf, and with the fire of my indignation I will preserve them." The government of the United States has been engaged for upwards of 7 years in gathering the remnants of Joseph, the Indians, to the very place where they will finally build the New Jerusalem, a city of Zion, with the acquisition of the believing Gentiles, who will gather with them from all the nations of the earth. And this gathering is clearly predicted in the Book of Mormon, and the place appointed and the time set for its fulfillment. And except the Gentiles repent of all their abominations and embrace the same covenant, the Book of Mormon, and come into the place of gathering, they will soon be destroyed from off the face of the land. As is written by Isaiah, "The nation and kingdom that will not serve thee shall perish." And I will state as a prophecy that there will not be an unbelieving Gentile on the face of this continent 50 years from this date, then the Book of Mormon will have proved itself false. End quote. That is terrifying. Well, and you can chalk up another failed Mormon prophecy, right? I mean, 50 years from this date, 1838, that the Book of Mormon will prove itself false if there is not an unbelieving Gentile on the face of the continent. I mean, that sort of came and went, and it's another false prophecy. That's a side point. What it's talking about here is absolutely terrifying. The central focus here is that the Gentiles will be taken over by the honest and upright Mormons, that the Native Americans are being gathered together, and that they will create this force that brings the will of the Lord, the Mormon theocracy, to fruition. And who determines what is and is not an abomination when it says that unless the people repent of their abominations? Well, that's Joseph Smith, of course. Printing that extract of scripture from the Doctrine and Covenants and from the Voice of Warning, this missionary tract, after it printed a piece of the July oration, the declaration of war, saying that it will be between us and them a war of extermination, given by Hinchpin Rigdon, it puts everything into context and articulates exactly what Joe and the Mormons had in mind for the United States at this time. But one can't simply overthrow the government and bring all Gentiles to repentance overnight. It takes political maneuvering, which is illustrated in the next passage printed in the Sangamo Journal. This is where Joe promises his votes to anyone who is a friend of the Mormons, regardless of political party. Quote, Joe Smith's Proclamation, State Gubernatorial Convention. The Gubernatorial Convention of the State of Illinois have nominated Colonel Adam W. Snyder for governor and Colonel John Moore for lieutenant governor of State of Illinois. Election to take place in the August next. Colonel Moore, like Judge Stephen A. Douglas and Esquire Warren, was an intimate friend of General Bennett long before that gentleman became a member of our community. And General Bennett informs us that no men were more efficient in assisting him to procure our chartered privileges, the Nauvoo Charter, than were Colonel Snyder and Colonel Moore. They are sterling men and friends of equal rights, opposed to the oppressor's grasp and the tyrant's rod. With such men at the head of our state government, we have nothing to fear. Snyder and Moore are known to be our friends. Their friendship is vouched for by those whom we have tried. We will never be justly charged with the sin of ingratitude. They have served us. We will serve them. Signed, Joseph Smith. End quote. The next article is incredible. It's titled, "They Can Already Dictate to the State of Illinois." Now, bear with me as I read through this, because I'm driving at a point that will wrap everything we've discussed today together. This article is a bit longer, and it begins with reporting that the New York Herald had been co-opted by the Mormons and was printing articles friendly to the Mormons under the guise of being critical. That shouldn't surprise anybody. But the content that Joe printed in the Herald should surprise all of us with how brazen and unabashed it is concerning the overthrow of the United States. This is an article printed by an agency friendly to the Mormons. It's terrifying, and the Sangamo Journal commentary afterwards is perfect. Quote, "Highly important from the Mormon Empire. Wonderful progress of Joe Smith. Spread of the Mormon faith and a new religious revolution at hand." Religious revolution at hand. What does that look like? "It is very evident that the Mormons exhibit a remarkable degree of tact, skill, shrewdness, energy, and enthusiasm. The particular features of their faith are nothing against their success. Do they believe their new Bible, their virgin revelation, their singular creed? If they do so with enthusiasm and practice their shrewd precepts, the other sects will fall before them. This is certain. This is human nature." Any emphasis that I'm giving? That's because the words are capitalized. "In Illinois, they have shown how to acquire a vast influence by holding the balance of power between both parties. They can already dictate to the state of Illinois, and if they pursue the same policy in other states, will they not soon dictate to Congress and decide the presidency? In all matters of public concernment, they act as one man, with one soul, one mind, and one purpose. Their religious and moral principles bind them together firmly. Verily, verily, we are truly in the latter days, and we should not be surprised to see that the Mormon religion is the real millennium already commenced. One thing is certain, the Mormons are so constituted that in these temperance times, they will swallow up all the other lukewarm Protestant sects, and the moral and religious world will be divided between the Pope and the Catholics on one side and Joe Smith and the Mormons on the other. The oyster is opening and will soon be equally divided." End quote. That was printed by the New York Herald that the Sangamo Journal alleges had been co-opted by Joseph Smith. That was an article friendly to Joseph Smith and the Mormons. But the commentary is great. Quote, "The Herald says the Mormons can already dictate to the state of Illinois, and are they not doing it? Has not Joe Smith issued a proclamation requiring his followers to vote for certain candidates for governor and lieutenant governor? The Herald calls the Mormon religion a virgin revelation, and that all other sects will fall before it. Precisely the same sentiment, though not the same words, was made use of by Judge Douglas on the same subject. He said to J.M. Ruggles, Esquire, that he believed there was as much true religion among them, the Mormons, as any other church, and that a new broom sweeps clean. Singular coincidence indeed." The next section of this same article is amazing. This was sent to the Sangamo Journal by an unnamed officer of the U.S. Artillery. After the letter, the editor says, "This letter requires no comment because it stands alone so well." Quote, "Yesterday was a great day among the Mormons." This is in the wake of one of their military parades that they had, I believe, in May of 1842. "Their legion, to the number of 2,000 men, was paraded by Generals Smith, Bennett, and others, and certainly made a very noble and imposing appearance. The evolutions of the troops directed by Major General Bennett would do honor to any body of armed militia in any of the states, and approximates very close to our regular forces. What does all this mean? Why this exact discipline of the Mormon Corps? Do they intend to conquer Missouri, Illinois, Mexico? It is true they are part of the militia of the state of Illinois by the charter of their legion, but then there are no troops in the states like them in point of enthusiasm and warlike aspect, yea, warlike character. Before many years, this legion will be 20 and perhaps 50,000 strong and still augmenting, a fearful host filled with religious enthusiasm and led on by ambitious and talented officers. What may not be affected by them? Perhaps a subversion of the Constitution of the United States, and if this be considered too great a task, foreign conquest will most certainly follow. Mexico will fall into their hands. These Mormons are accumulating, like a snowball rolling down an inclined plane, which in the end becomes an avalanche. They are also enrolling among their officers some of the first talent in the country by tittles or bribes. It don't matter which. They have appointed your namesake, Captain Bennett, late of the Army of the United States, Inspector General of their Legion, and he is commissioned as such by Governor Carlin. This gentleman is known to be well skilled in fortification, gunnery, ordnance, castrametation, and military engineering generally, and I am assured that he is now under pay derived from the tithings of this warlike people. I have seen his plans for fortifying Nauvoo, which are equal to any of the Vauban. I arrived here incog on the 1st instant, and from the great preparation of the military parade, was induced to stay to see the turnout, which I confess has astonished and filled me with fears for future consequences. The Mormons, it is true, are now peaceable, but the lion is asleep. Take care and don't rouse him. End quote. That's all we're going to read out of the Sangamo Journal for today. We're going to pick up next week and really get into the meat of the July 8th issue, where Bennett's expose actually makes its way onto paper. So given everything that we've read so far, what does this all mean? Mormonism in Nauvoo wasn't a church. It wasn't a religion. It wasn't a scheme contrived by a fraud to make some money. And it may have been those things at different points, but Nauvoo Mormonism is completely a different beast. Joe spent more time on swaying politics than he did preaching sermons. He was more occupied with letter exchanges with politicians than church leaders. Let's bring this into today's time. This last weekend was a big event in Mormonism. Braden and I talk about it on the latest Glassbox podcast episode. Sam Young's Excommunication Council, Court of Love as they call it. It was President Nelson's 94th birthday, and Apostle Quentin L. Cook did a young adults face-to-face event on Facebook from the Nauvoo Temple. September 9th. It was a big day. Sam Young says, remember, the 9th of September. That's their newest catchphrase on Protect LDS Children, and I think it is important that we do always remember what has happened. But this face-to-face event, that's what I want to talk about with Quentin L. Cook. It's their latest stop in the Saints book tour, and it's very clearly just a pitch for the book. Almost every single answer has something about the new book, and it's usually coupled with, this is where you can find answers to the question that you just asked that I didn't answer. And honestly, after watching that event, I hope that people read Saints, the Standard of Truth, this new history book of Mormonism. And what I've read so far leads me to conclude that it's a great introduction to deeper Mormon history. It contains facts about Joseph Smith that millions of members don't have the first clue exist. Now, this Facebook event talked a bit about Joseph Smith's early life, and then they threw the guest panel of historians a few not hardballs, but marshmallows about the seer stones and then polygamy. And every time they punted and just said to read the book. So it must be the new standard of truth about Mormon history, right? Good thing it's free on the Gospel Library app. Yeah, of course. They're trying to streamline a little bit. No, Mr. Nelson, is it powered on? Is the power turned on? Okay. Is the screen lit up? No. Okay. Push the power button. No, not that button. It's the one with the straight up line and the circle around it. Yeah, the big button. Yeah. No, it's not on your keyboard. It's the button on the box that's sitting on the desk. Okay. Good job. Now let's open Internet Explorer. I mean, the thing is, anytime conversations about Mormon history happen across this believing divide, there's always a vast chasm that can rarely be surmounted. What I mean by that is, oftentimes the majority of chapel-attending Mormons haven't read the Gospel Topics essay, they don't know the word anachronism, and they just don't have the first inkling of what exists in the body of Mormon history. There's this massive body of knowledge that needs to be understood for Mormons to get to the level of mature faith instead of the naive faith that the church has indoctrinated them with. And of course, those are in air quotes. That's why the CES letter and Rough Stone Rolling are such popular resources when people begin to question the truth claims of Mormonism. There's an informational hurdle before concluding that the church is a fraud. But beyond it lies an absence of cognitive dissonance. Where there used to be Mormon shelves, now there's a bookshelf. This standard of truth is going to have an impact on membership. Now, the Joseph Smith of that book is not friendly to a faltering testimony. Consider everything we've discussed in this episode so far. If the Joseph Smith in this Standard of Truth book scares you away from the church, there's no way you can handle Joe after his world is broken by Wreck-It Bennett. Mormons aren't going to like Joseph Smith when he's angry. If Joseph Smith using magic and seer stones is a problem for a person's testimony, what will Joseph Smith translating ancient Egyptian without knowing the first thing about Egyptology do to that shaky foundation? If Joseph Smith marrying 33 wives is hard for a person to wrestle with, what goes through their minds when they learn how he acquired those wives? If Joseph Smith gave a revelation that Zion will be built on the American continent, and then a person hears about him giving a sermon that he'll become a Muhammad unto this generation, how does that person go on to bear their testimony that he's the true prophet? Was he declaring that as a prophet? Was he declaring that as a man? Or was he declaring it as a desperate cult leader, hell-bent on conquering Missouri? I mean, the church doesn't interfere in politics, right? But the founding prophet ran for president of the United States trying to overthrow the government and was assassinated during his campaign. How do you deal with that? There's this informational divide that needs to be surmounted. Maybe the Saints book, the Standard of Truth, is going to do it. The two-dimensional Joseph Smith of naive faith, once again in air quotes, that regular chapel-going Mormons know doesn't do these people any favors when more dimensions are added and that body of information is expanded and understood to a greater depth. Maybe Saints will bridge that informational gap during conversations about church history with loved ones. If this book has the reach the leadership wants, it'll have an impact they don't want. That's going to do it for today's episode. Once again, if you are a supporter on Patreon, be sure to check out the Patreon-only feed. You're going to hear the history of the Saints from top to bottom. Just like the new patrons that we have, looks like we have a pledge edit by Joe and new pledges by Josh and Kari. So to our pledge edit as well as our new pledges, thank you so much for supporting the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, where you get extended ad-free editions of the podcast a few hours earlier than the regular feed, and you get access to all of the exclusive Patreon-only content, including the Nemo Book Club, where we're reading through the history of the Saints by General John C. Bennett. With that, let's go ahead and shut it down for the evening. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.